This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
Have you ever wondered what the world was like before the flood? Not the human world, but the natural world, with the animals and their habitats. I'm sure we all have a picture in our minds from the conventional imagery with dinosaurs and strange-looking creatures in jungles with giant ferns and stuff. But if you take what the Bible says to be true, how would that imagery line up with, say, the animals on the ark? I think most of us, when we picture Noah's Ark, it's all giraffes, elephants, and lions, and zebras, mostly African animals. But wouldn't it make sense that some of those animals would line up with what's found in the fossil record? Well, paleobiologist Paul Garner was wondering the same thing. So he wrote a book about it called Fossils and the Flood. And Henry Smith got a chance to talk with him about it and about all the illustrations it has that might look a little different than what you're used to. Paul Garner is a researcher and lecturer for the Biblical Creation Trust in the United Kingdom. He has a master's degree in geoscience and specializes in paleobiology. Here's Henry.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Very good. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Sorry we didn't get to meet face to face. I couldn't get to the ICC this year. You were in the States. That was a bit disappointing.
I was.
But I'm glad it was a good time.
The ICC was great, yeah. I was actually over for 3 weeks because I was with Todd for a week before ICC, and then I was in St. Louis afterwards for a week as well. So yeah. But the whole trip was good. Yeah.
Do you get to the United States often, or?
Usually once a year. Usually in the summer. I try to get over for the Origins conference. That's usually in July.
Yeah. Well, we're excited to have you on the program to talk about your book, Fossils and the Flood. This is a wonderful book. I've had a very enjoyable time reading through it, and we're going to be discussing it today and hopefully edifying people and showing them how they can trust the Bible. But before we get into that, Paul, I would love to have you introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us about what you do, Biblical Creation Trust, which you're a part of, and your passion about this subject.
Yeah, sure. I'm a researcher and lecturer with Biblical Creation Trust, which is a small creationist organization here in the UK. I've been doing that for about 20 years now. My background is in the earth and the life sciences. My master's degree is in geoscience with an emphasis in paleobiology, which is all about fossils and the history of life. And in fact, my postgraduate research was in dinosaur diversity. I'm also a co-host of the Let's Talk Creation podcast with Dr. Todd Wood, fortnightly podcast. We have various guests on. It's available on YouTube and all the usual sort of streaming platforms. And I'm the author of a couple of books that people might know about. The New Creationism, which was a popular level overview of the creation model, and then Fossils and the Flood, which is the book that we're going to be talking about today.
I didn't have a chance to thank you for letting me come on your show and do the Septuagint episode. I really appreciate. That was great, yeah. I really appreciated doing that. Hopefully, we can do some more on that. There's a lot more to.
I hope so.
A lot more to talk about with that. But
sure.
We do want to get into our conversation about the book. I guess the starting point would be, Paul, if we think about where did the idea of the book come from, the genesis of the book, if you want to say it that way.
Sure. Well, when I was a boy, I loved books about prehistoric animals. I just love those, the kind of books I mean, those fantastic books with dioramas showing ancient environments populated by dinosaurs and all of these other long extinct animals. In fact, this book that I've got right here, you can see that it was very well loved because it's got a very ragged cover. It was Prehistoric Animals, The Extraordinary Story of Life Before Man. And, I loved these books. That was the actual copy I had, when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And these books really just set my imagination alight. And it was books like that that really got me interested in fossils and geology. But of course, you can probably tell from the title that these books were written from an evolutionary perspective. And later in life, as a creationist, I began to think, where are the books that are like this, but which tell the story of the history of life from a biblical creationist perspective? And so that's really what I wanted to do with Fossils and the Flood, to offer a kind of robustly creationist alternative to the kinds of evolutionary books that really inspired me to get into geology and fossils when I was a boy.
Yeah, hearing that and seeing your book reminded me, my grandmother was a school teacher, and I remember when I was a boy, I would stay at her house sometimes in the summer. She'd put us to work, by the way. We didn't get to play on video games and stuff. But one of the things, she was a school teacher, so there was books like that. And they were, I think a lot of people that are now our age, when we grew up, we were fascinated by that kind of thing. But we're obviously approaching this from a different paradigm perspective, a different worldview perspective. The animals obviously existed, but the timing and the events are different. So obviously you wanted to tackle that issue, but even you mentioned to me the idea about thinking about like species, for example, of our arc pictures that we typically have. Tell us a little bit about that. I found that interesting.
Yeah, sure. So there are already books available, that kind of give a Christian perspective on creation and the flood. But one of the things that concern me is, even though they were often beautifully produced, is that they didn't always get the details right. So you'd have the story of the flood told as this kind of cute children's story, the kind of thing with the boat tub arc, the bathtub arc, and the giraffe with his head stuck out the top, and the elephant stuck in the door, and all that kind of stuff. So the size and the likely shape of the ark would all be wrong, or all of the animals on the ark would be portrayed as modern animals, modern species like lions and tigers and things like that, rather than the ancestral animal that was probably represented on the ark that then gave rise to all of those modern varieties and species. And even creationist books that I think tried to put some of those things right also missed, I think, some things, like they would often portray Noah and his family as very typical Bible story type characters, perhaps dressed in rather anachronistic clothes, or portrayed almost as if they were sort of white Western Europeans or something like that.
Yes.
Or maybe they'd have dinosaurs on the ark, but there would be lots of other extinct animals that ought to be represented on the ark that would be missing. So I was very keen in this book to try to draw upon the best biblical and scientific scholarship within creationism, to try to get some of those details right, and to sort of present that in a popular way to a lay audience.
Yeah, that's excellent. Tell us about the illustrations. There are literally hundreds of them. I mean, I just thought about the hours it would have taken to do that. And tell us a little bit about your illustrator, Jean.
Yes, well, sadly, sadly for us, Jean went to be with the Lord. She was a remarkable lady. I first met her at my church. I was giving a talk about dinosaurs, and she came up to me afterwards, said, "Look, would you come and look at some paintings I've done based on the stories in the book of Genesis?" So my wife and I went round to visit her at her home. Soon as she brought out all of these wonderful watercolor paintings, I was just so struck by how good they were. And I said, "Jean, these are fantastic. How about working on a book project with me?" So that's what we did. She kind of threw herself into this project, and I very much see this book as much her book as it is mine, because it really wouldn't be what it is without all of Jean's fantastic illustrations. Over 200 watercolor paintings that she did for this book, including lots of wonderful dioramas.
That's a major feature of the book, is the illustrations. Really draws out your imagination, not only for adults, but for kids as well. Talk about that a little bit more, and part of the strategy with that for younger people.
Sure. I was so pleased that Jean got to see the book, after all the amazing work that she did on it. And I think that the illustrations, Jean has got this fantastic, lively, colourful style. And I think it would just help to draw in particularly younger people to enjoy this book. So when I wrote the text, I kind of, intended the text to be aimed at maybe teens up. And I think when you first look at the book, you might think it's aimed at younger readers. But I think it's a book that the whole family can enjoy, because children will just absolutely love all of these fantastic, colourful paintings. But then the text allows you to sort of dig deeper into the subject. And Jean just did this fantastic job, particularly in these wonderful reconstructions. We tried to sort of reconstruct what the world was like before the flood in unprecedented detail. Nobody had ever sort of published a book like this one. And then also looking at environments after the flood, the recovery of the world after the flood. And Jean, she hadn't really got any science training, but she took the source material that I was giving her, and she just came up with these absolutely fabulous illustrations that I know everybody will enjoy.
Yeah, and to your point, you've taken the evidence of what we know of, okay, so we have like modern cats, for example, or horses, and we put them on the ark in these pictures. But what you did was look at the scientific literature and what ancestors of cats and horses would have looked like. And so she did such a wonderful job of drawing them. But I'd like you to talk about not only the drawings and their accuracy, but the reasons why we know pretty good detail about why they look this way and they don't quite look like the way they do today.
Sure. So when we look at the fossil record, take horses, for example, we see a huge number of fossil horses. There's much more diversity in the horses than we see today. And those fossil horses are in what we think are post-flood rocks. So all of that diversity must have come from the original pair of horses that Noah took on the ark. So that pair of horses didn't really look like modern horses. In fact, the oldest horse that we find in the fossil record is this rather small animal. It had different kind of teeth. They were sort of browsing teeth rather than teeth for grazing. And it had multiple toes on the foot rather than the single hoof. And it looks as if this original ancestral horse, the representative of the horse kind that Noah took on the ark, then gave rise to all of the species of horse that we find in the fossil record. So what I did was I went back to look at what are the earliest post-flood representatives of all of these different groups. And those are the animals that we represented as the animals that were on the ark, rather than the modern species, which are actually their descendants.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most intriguing parts of your book. It makes total sense. You're basing it on the evidence that's been uncovered through paleontology, that's been dug up in fossil record and all that kind of thing. And I really appreciated that. Although I have to say, when I looked at the creatures, I'm like, these look so unfamiliar. So that was an adjustment that folks will have to make. But I love that, hey, we want to get at what did this really look like? Yeah. Maybe comment on that a little bit more, Paul.
Yeah, sure. And actually, your reaction is exactly the reaction that Jean had when I was first sort of giving her the source material, because, she would sometimes push back and say, why are we illustrating it this way? And I would try and explain, here's what the scientific studies are telling us. And, I was very keen that we tried to get those scientific details as correct as we could. Maybe I didn't always get the details right, but I was trying to draw on the very best scholarship, the very latest research that creationists are doing that tells us what those animals on the ark were like. And I think in many ways, what I've done in the book is in line with, for example, what's been done at the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, where again, if you look around the displays, you'll see that the animals that are included as representatives of the kinds on the ark often look very unfamiliar. They're not the modern animals that typically you see in children's storybooks.
Yeah, that's very good. We were at the Ark Encounter about 6 years ago, me and my family, and that was part of it too, but a little faded memory. So your book kind of drew that back out. So we want to encourage folks. Oh, and by the way, you mentioned the most recent science literature. The book is not bogged down with footnotes, but you make that information available online, and folks can see that in the book. So it's backed up by solid research. Okay, Paul, let's talk about themes in the book. Now, obviously a theme is fossils, because that's in the title, and that you really focus on that in chapter 5 with it.
So fossils are basically the remains or traces of once living organisms. In most cases, they were buried in sediments, sedimentary rocks that were deposited by water. So things like mudstones, sandstones, siltstones. And most fossils represent the hard parts of organisms. They're the easiest parts to preserve. So things like shell or bone, we call those body fossils. But there are also fossils which are not parts of the organisms themselves, but represent the traces of their activity. We call those trace fossils, and they might be things like footprints or animal burrows. And so I was sort of basically drawing on the information that we can get from the fossil record as we know it, in order to then reconstruct the history of life within that biblical framework of creation, fall, flood, Babel, and so on.
Yeah, very good. So in the book, you go through, you show a lot of material with the fossils. If you could quickly talk about conditions for fossilization.
Sure. Most dead creatures today, of course, don't end up being fossilized. They get eaten, they get scavenged, they rot, and they decay. So you need very exceptional circumstances in most cases for fossils to be preserved. And there are a range of things that make it more likely that you're going to end up in the fossil record. Having hard parts, as we already mentioned, being buried in an environment that has low oxygen levels, that helps to slow down decay. But by far the most important factor is rapid burial. If an organism is buried rapidly, that prevents it from being eaten, from being scavenged, and it kind of assists in the whole preservation process. And of course, the flood, the worldwide flood in the days of Noah, would have provided exceptional circumstances where rapid burial would be able to preserve large numbers of fossils.
Excellent. So lots to say about fossils. I just love the fossil discussion. I remember as a kid, I had a fish fossil that my grandmother gave me. I've got it somewhere in the archive. And so let's talk about it. You talked about conditions for fossilization, but there's lots of other stuff to talk about. I'll let you do that.
Sure. One of the things I do in the book, I have a whole section at the back where I talk about all of the major groups of fossil organisms that we find. So I wanted to sort of make this an educational resource, that families could enjoy together. So we have a wide variety of different groups in the fossil record, from microscopic organisms to plants to invertebrates and vertebrates. And, I go through all of those groups and I give examples, information about them, where they're found in the fossil record and so on. I also kind of set the fossils in context. So we talk about the fossil record itself, the sedimentary rock layers that contain those fossils are found in a predictable order all around the world. We call that the geological column. It's a kind of an idealized cross-section, if you like, of the sedimentary rocks in the earth. It's what you would see if all of the rock layers were complete in sequence, in one place. And it has many different divisions and subdivisions, and we find different kinds of fossils in different parts of the geological column. So if you think about dinosaurs, for example, they are found in Upper Triassic to Cretaceous rock layers and not in other parts of the geological column. And trilobites, these segmented marine arthropods, we only find those in the Cambrian to Permian sedimentary layers. So there's this predictable order. Now, of course, that raises a question, which is, what does this mean? How do we explain this sequential order of the fossils? Well, of course, according to the evolutionary viewpoint, this stack of rock layers was deposited over a very long period of time. It represents hundreds of millions of years of Earth history. And the fossils that we find in these different rock layers represent the animals and plants and other organisms that were living at different periods in Earth history. And the order in which we find the fossils represents the order in which these different groups evolved over long periods of time. Now, of course, the creationist viewpoint is very different. Creationists believe that these sedimentary rock layers were laid down over much shorter periods of time. Many of them were deposited, of course, during the worldwide flood in the days of Noah. And so the fossil animals and plants preserved in these rock layers represent the organisms that were buried sequentially during the worldwide flood, and then the uppermost part of the column probably represents the time when the earth was recovering after the flood, and the animals were sort of spreading out from the landing site of the ark and repopulating the earth. So we have these two very different models for understanding what this rock sequence and the fossil sequence means, and all of that is also explained in the book.
And I appreciated that sketch and overview of, I personally have encountered that general sketch that you just laid out numerous times, but it was good to see it again, to see it in a fresh way. One of the questions that comes up, Paul, always, that you address this in the book, is the issue of human fossils. Could you give us a tutorial on that? Why, basically the question is, why don't we seem to find human fossils from the world before the flood?
Sure. So creationists disagree a bit about exactly where does the flood end in the geological record, but I think the most likely place where the flood ends is at the end of what we call the Mesozoic rock layers. So that's about where the dinosaurs disappear. And what that means, if that's correct, is that we don't have any human fossils in flood rocks. So they're missing. And people often ask that question, why don't we have human fossils in the flood rocks? I think the question is a bit broader, because not only do we not have humans in those flood rocks, but most of the mammals are missing, most of the birds are missing, most of the flowering plants are missing. We find those as fossils in what we think are the post-flood layers, but we don't find them in the flood rocks. When I look at that, when I look at humans, birds, mammals, flowering plants, that looks to me like a whole biome, a whole coherent ecosystem. So it looks as if the ecosystem, the biome where the humans were living before the flood, for some reason, was not preserved in the flood rocks. It was preferentially destroyed during the flood. And I think at this point we can get into lots of speculation about why that might have been. Perhaps the humans were living right on top of one of the fountains of the great deep that broke open at the beginning of the flood, Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11. Maybe they were destroyed during the catastrophic tectonics that was going on during the flood. Maybe they were just sort of washed away into the ocean and not preserved. We can speculate about why that might be, but I think it looks as if that entire biome was destroyed. And of course, maybe that was part of the purpose of the flood, was to wipe mankind from the face of the earth.
Yeah, I think that's good. I just say one of the things I like about your book is that you set these theories tentatively. The scripture governs the idea. Okay, here's some plausible scenarios of why we don't have human fossils. They seem reasonable, but we don't know. And I really appreciated that tone and sort of approach to it. So we brought up the subject of biomes, and you talk about that quite a bit in your book. Tell us what a biome is. Tell us what we know about the world that then was, as it were.
Yeah, so you quote there 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 6, I think, the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. And, an obvious question is, what was that world like, that original world before the flood, which I call in the book the old world? We know that it was destroyed, but we have some clues from both the Bible and from the science of geology that I think can help us to, reconstruct what that world might have been like. And that's what I try to do in the book. So we know it was a very different world. There are clues preserved in the Earth's rock layers that indicate that even the continents and oceans were in different places. They were arranged differently than the world today. It seems that there was a kind of supercontinent, a giant sort of supersized continent that geologists call Rodinia, that broke apart during the flood, maybe reassembled sort of in the middle of the flood and then broke apart. But there's lots of disagreement about exactly the details, but we can sort of work backwards and try to work out what that world looked like, how the continents were arranged. There was much greater diversity, it seems, in the world before the flood. We have lots and lots of animals and plants in the fossil record that we don't have in the world today. So it seems that when God at creation made the world, he filled it with this superabundance of diversity, and much of that diversity has been lost, because of the flood, because of extinction. And so today we look at a world which is greatly impoverished in terms of its diversity. But we can look at the fossils and we can begin to sort of work backwards, as it were, to say, what was the diversity of the world before the flood? And we can begin to reconstruct those, what I've called biomes. They're large habitats populated by a particular distinctive community of animals and plants. And it seems that there were many different kinds of biomes on the surface of the earth, many that we don't actually have in the world today. They never recovered after the flood, so they've essentially become extinct. Those biomes are either completely absent from the modern world, or we only have small remnants that where you just get a glimpse of what one of these biomes was like.
Yeah, one of the ones that you feature in the book is, if I'm using the terminology right, floating forest.
Sure.
Now, I'd like you to talk about that, but I wanted to ask you a question too. Does the idea of the floating forest, is that also a secular idea, or is that unique to creation science? If you could explore that question and then tell us about the floating forest. Fascinating part of the book, and this is another reason why, folks, we want to encourage you to pick it up.
Sure. A lot of people have sort of focused in on the floating forest because it's such an unfamiliar idea, and it is unique to creationism. It was a model that was proposed by a creationist paleontologist, Dr. Kurt Wise, and he based it on a whole range of different kinds of data. But the idea is that before the flood, there was this huge, thick floating mat of vegetation that was over the deep ocean, and it was a really extensive continent-sized mat of vegetation, a bit like the vegetation that grows out sometimes over lakes today, and it forms a kind of mat thick enough that you can walk on the mat, but it's actually floating over the water. So the idea is that around the edges, around the margins of this mat, there were small plants that lacked true roots, that were very dependent on being close to water. And then as you go further into the mat, where it was much thicker, it was able to support larger plants, bushes and shrubs and even large trees. And we know from the fossil record that some of these plants were designed for life in this kind of floating mat. They had hollow stems, hollow trunks, hollow roots that were designed to be lightweight and float on water. And it seems that during the flood, this huge, unique biome drifted over the continents, and wave action began to tear it apart, rip it to pieces from the outside in. So the first plants that get buried are those plants living around the edges. They get buried in maybe the Silurian and Devonian layers, and then the central part of the floating forest where the trees are, that gets ripped apart and eventually buried to form the Carboniferous coal layers, the coal seams. And this floating forest model helps to explain many things. It helps to explain the weird anatomy of the plants that we find. It helps to explain the order in which we find the plant fossils. It helps to explain why we find coal beds in association with a marine environment. So it explains many, many pieces of data. And so I sort of reconstructed that in the book. There's a lovely illustration that Jean did showing this floating forest and kind of pointing to where the different plants and animals were living within the floating forest.
Yeah, I found that to be really interesting. And what I like about the proposal that you're basing it on partly on Kurt Wise's work is that you test the model, right?
Right.
Maybe in the next minute we could talk about that a little bit, Paul, because creation science has changed over the years, but so has secular science in terms of our theories, because we're talking about the past.
Sure. I think we always have to remember that our scientific models are not on the same level as Scripture, right? Scripture is supreme. Scripture, has the primacy. the Bible tells us some clear facts about the flood and that it was worldwide and so on. But then when we begin to try to understand the data in the science of geology and paleontology, we build models, and those models, we try to make them so that they're consistent with scripture. But our models are, may be wrong. We may sometimes get details of those things wrong. We always have to remember scientific theories, scientific models are provisional. They're always open to be modified or even abandoned as we discover new things, as we make new discoveries, new ways of thinking come along. And so one of the things I'm always keen to emphasize is that we have the scripture. It gives us this framework of Earth history, but when we begin to fill in the details, we always have to remember that those details are open to change because those are ideas that we as fallible human beings have come up with, and we don't always get the details right. So sure, one of the things I emphasized about the book is this is our best guess right now. This is where I think the scholarship is pointing. But we have to remember, in 10 years' time, if I were to go back and revisit this book, maybe some of the details would be different.
Excellent. Great tutorial on that. Okay, Paul. We want to shift back to fossils again because how can we not? I mean, this is such an enormous part of this whole discussion. So I'm going to just say fossils and let you go with whatever you want to talk about because I'm ready to hear it.
Okay. Well, why don't we think about some of the kinds of evidence that fossils provide for the flood itself? One of the things, obviously, about fossils is that they're buried in sedimentary rock layers. And those sedimentary rock layers are often very thick and very extensive. And they're also mostly deposited under marine conditions. And so when you see marine rock layers that are essentially covering the continents, blanketing the continents, then they're pointing to something very strange that's going on. And of course, that very strange thing is the worldwide flood in the days of Noah. We don't today see thick, extensive marine layers being deposited over the continents. One of my favorite examples, I guess, is the chalk, which is found in the Upper Cretaceous part of the geological column. And chalk is a remarkable, very distinctive type of rock. It's composed of billions and billions of tiny microscopic marine algae that they secrete these carbonate skeletons, these shells, and they're called coccoliths, the plates that they secrete. And chalk is just composed of billions and billions of these things. And also we find, of course, other kinds of fossils embedded in the chalk. We find sea urchins and we find ammonites and other things. And the chalk is so extensive. It's very famous, of course, because it forms the White Cliffs here in England, on the south coast of England. But you can find it in North America. The Upper Cretaceous chalks are found in Alabama, the Selma chalk, or in Texas, the Austin chalk. It also extends across much of northwestern Europe. It underlies much of Denmark. You can trace it as far as Turkey. And then even in Australia, there are Upper Cretaceous chalks. So you've got this incredible blanket of this unique kind of sediment that is just found on this incredible scale. And to me, that speaks of global processes during the worldwide flood. And of course, one of the other things is that the fossils testify to conditions of rapid burial. We already talked about the importance of being buried rapidly to ensure that you're preserved as a fossil. And just to give you a few examples, there are some amazing fossil fish preserved in the Lower Cretaceous Santana Formation in Brazil. And these fish are incredibly well preserved. Often delicate soft tissues are preserved. And when scientists have compared the state of preservation of these fossil fish with the way that modern fish decay after death, they came to the conclusion that these fish must have been buried within 5 hours of death. In fact, they may even have been beginning to be fossilized as the animal was swimming in the water column. I mean, this is just extraordinary stuff. But this is remarkable preservation. You can also think about trilobites. They're often favorites of fossil collectors. They're these lovely segmented sort of marine arthropods, all extinct, and some of them were able to curl up into a protective ball, and you often find them fossilized in that position. They'd curled up to protect themselves and were buried alive in that sort of position. We have dinosaur fossils where they have this characteristic death pose, this death posture, with the back is arched and the head is thrown back and the mouth is open. And this is a death posture that's associated with drowning. So, as you begin to look at the fossil record, you see so much evidence of rapid burial, which is, of course, exactly what we'd expect with a worldwide flood, where animals are just being decimated on this global scale. One other feature that might be worth mentioning here, Henry, concerns fossilized trackways.
Yes.
We talked about these trace fossils, so you have fossilized footprints. And one curious feature of the fossil record is that very often we find the earliest fossil trackways turn up before the body fossils of the animals that left the trackways. So you have the trackways showing up, and then in rock layers above the trackways, you begin to get the first body fossils of the animals. We see that in the dinosaur fossil record. We see it with trilobites, actually. So trilobite trackways turn up before the first body fossils of trilobites. And from a conventional old age perspective, that's quite hard to explain. You would expect to find the body fossils and the trackways showing up in the same layers. But the flood model perhaps helps us to explain that, because during the flood, there would have been a time when animals were alive, moving around, leaving tracks, leaving footprints. But later, as they became exhausted, as they got buried, as they expired, then the body fossils would show up. So we might expect to find trackways and then the body fossils turning up a bit later. So a really intriguing pattern in the fossil record that I think creationists have an explanation for.
Yeah, I was intrigued by that, and I thought that was interesting. I always thought about the footprints as, sort of rapid flash buried in time, but it never occurred to me that the life form shows up in the record after the footprints, which, right, as you mentioned, doesn't fit the long age evolutionary view. It fits the flood one much better. Lots of stuff about fossils in the book. People need to, if they want to know more, they've got to pick up your book. And also the footnote information is also listed. If they really want to dig deep, you back it all up in that manner. Okay, so now we want to shift our discussion to a period that, historically speaking, is somewhat of a mystery to us. In the Bible, we have a genealogy after the flood, and all of a sudden then we have Abraham at some point later on. But there's a lot of stuff from the scientific world that's been looked at that we would interpret as post-flood. So let's talk about the boundary and talk about whatever you want with that.
Sure. So I think we already mentioned that creationists disagree a bit about exactly where the end of the flood is in the geological record, but I think there are good reasons to put it about the place where the dinosaurs disappear from the geological record, because there does seem to be a kind of a shift from worldwide or certainly continental scale sedimentary deposits to much more regional scale and then local scale deposits. There's also a very marked break in the fossil record at that point. So I think that's a good place to say that's when the animals begin to spread out and repopulate the Earth from the landing site of the Ark. Now, there's all kinds of interesting questions that then arise. How did the animals repopulate the world? We think that by the end of the flood, the continents were in roughly their present day positions, where you had land masses separated by wide oceans. And so animals had to cross ocean barriers to get to the places where we find them today. Now, of course, during the Ice Age, which occurred after the flood, maybe we'll come on to that, then there may have been some land bridges that were exposed where animals could get across those land bridges. But there were also animals that were migrating to these places before the Ice Age. And one of the ways that they may have made that journey is on vegetation rafts. So if you think about the flood as this worldwide catastrophic event, it ripped up all of the world's forests. It destroyed the world's forests, swept them into the oceans. And so after the flood, there would have been an enormous amount of vegetation debris floating in the ocean. Some of it would have sunk and been buried, but much of it probably stayed afloat for maybe centuries after the flood. A bit like you sometimes see after a tsunami today, you will often find these vegetation rafts. And these rafts after the flood were so big that perhaps animals were attracted onto them as a source of food. You could imagine plant-eating animals going onto these rafts, and then the carnivores, following the plant eaters. And then as these rafts drifted with the ocean currents, these animals could be transported across ocean and sea barriers. And it seems a kind of wild idea. A lot of people kind of think, is that really tenable? But it actually helps to explain quite a lot of data. For example, we have a lot of strange distributions of animals that we call split ranges, where you find the same animals on either sides of an ocean barrier, but nowhere in between. And it seems as if those places are connected by ocean circulation, by ocean currents. And so we can explain, those split ranges by animals rafting across the ocean, being carried by the ocean currents. One of the other things, of course, that the animals were doing were, as they came off the ark, they were then diversifying. They were giving rise to the species and varieties that we have today. So on the ark, there would have been perhaps an ancestral pair of cats, an ancestral pair of horses, an ancestral pair of dogs, and so on. And then all of the diversity that we see within those groups today must have been descended from those ark survivors. And so there was a period, it seems, when there was an explosive episode of diversification as those animals began to multiply and to fill the earth. And that's an interesting thing to think about. What were the mechanisms that led to that rapid diversification?
Yeah, excellent. Okay, I'd like to take this last 2 minutes to talk about the importance of this, Paul.
Sure.
Why is this ultimately important? And I'd like you to share that with the audience as we wrap up.
Sure. I think one of the things that makes this subject so important is that the reality of the flood underlies the essential historicity of the Christian faith. The flood is not a myth. It's not a legend. It's not proto-history. It was a real event that actually happened, and we see evidence of it all around us in the rock layers and in the fossils. And the flood, as we've said, was this pivotal event. It was a kind of turning point in the history of the world when an old world was destroyed and a new world began. The flood was the undoing of the original creation. The waters that covered the earth in the beginning covered the earth again at the time of the flood. And it points forward to a time when there'll be a new creation, when Christ returns to the earth. And the ark, of course, reminds us of Christ himself. The ark was a type of Christ. And just as Noah had to be in the ark in order to be saved through the flood, so we need to be in Christ. And so the flood is really important. It has a gospel message for us.
Yeah, Paul, that's really excellent. I mean, we love the science. We love archaeology here and apologetics and defending the faith and all those things. And those hopefully are helpful to the church and hopefully draw people into the kingdom. But the essential point here is, the most fundamental point is the reliability of the Bible and the message that comes in it. And so, Paul, thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you for writing this book, and congrats to you and our friend Gene, who's gone home to be with the Lord. Appreciate what you've done here. Appreciate your partnership in the gospel, and thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Henry. It's been a joy.
If you want to check out Paul Garner's book, Fossils in the Flood, you can get a copy anywhere books are sold, or you can buy it from the ABR bookstore, and that helps out the ABR ministry a little bit. That's all we have for today. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.